Hello guys! Today we uncover the terrifying story of the man who made kings tremble and cities burn, Tamerlane. He slaughtered millions, built towers of skulls, and even turned fire-breathing camels into weapons of war. This is not just history. This is the tale of humanity's greatest nightmare. Stay with me, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because once you hear this story, you'll never look at history the same way again. In the heart of Central Asia, on the wide steppe of Transoxiana, a child was born in the spring of 1336, whose name would one day terrify empires from Delhi to Damascus, from the steppes of Russia to the gates of China. His birth name was Timur ibn Taragai Barrows, though the world would later know him simply as Tamerlane. Timur the Lane. The epithet came from a wound he received in his youth, but the legend it carried masked the truth. Behind that limp stood one of the most brilliant, ruthless, and ambitious conquerors of the medieval world. Timur was born near the city of Kesh, later known as Shari Subs, not far from the great trading hub of Samarkand. He belonged to the Barrows tribe, a Mongol clan that had settled in the region after the conquests of Genghis Khan. By Timur's birth, the Barrows had long since adopted Turkic language and Islamic faith, yet they still carried the fierce military traditions of the Mongols. This blend of cultures, Turco-Mongol steppe traditions, Islamic governance, and Persian cultural influence, would later shape Timur's empire. Timur's father, Taragai, was a respected noble but not a ruler of great power. His family was influential in the Barlas tribe, but not supreme. Thus, from an early age, Timur understood the importance of alliances, cunning, and force in order to rise above rivals. He was not born into empire. He would have to build one with his own hands. As a boy, Timur grew up surrounded by tales of Genghis Khan. The Mongol conqueror's ghost still haunted Central Asia. Every tribe, every chieftain, every petty ruler compared himself against that legendary figure. Timur absorbed those stories deeply. He was said to have memorized strategies, victories, and even anecdotes of Genghis's cunning. To Timur, the Great Khan was not just a figure of the past. He was a model to surpass. Yet Timur's youth was not free of hardship. As a teenager, he joined raids and battles, the usual proving ground for young warriors of the steppe. In one such skirmish, he was struck in the leg and hand by arrows. The wounds never healed properly. His right leg became crippled, giving him the limp that earned him the name Timur-I-Lang, Timur the Lame, and his hand was partially disabled. In a society that valued strength, this could have doomed his ambitions. But instead, Timur turned weakness into legend. His limp made him appear more ruthless, more determined, more chosen by destiny. He compensated for physical limitation with intellect, charisma, and unmatched cruelty when necessary. Timur's rise began in a world of fragmentation. The once mighty Chagatai Khanate, descended from Genghis Khan's son Chagatai, had splintered into feuding tribes and rival warlords. Persia to the west was divided, the Golden Horde to the north was weakened, and the Delhi Sultanate in India was rich but unstable. Central Asia was a chessboard of shifting alliances. Timur realized early that power would go not to the strongest, but to the cleverest player of this deadly game. By his 20s, Timur had already gathered a band of loyal warriors. He mastered the art of steppe politics, marrying into powerful families, forging alliances through both diplomacy and betrayal. One of his earliest allies was Hussein, a fellow warlord, with whom he carved out influence in Transoxiana. But Timur was never satisfied to share power. Even as he cooperated, he studied his partner's weaknesses, preparing for the day when he would eliminate him. What made Timur truly formidable was not merely his sword, but his mind for strategy. He understood terrain, timing, and psychology. He could predict how enemies would react, then trap them with ruthless efficiency. He studied Persian administrators, learning the subtleties of tax systems and bureaucracy. He admired Islamic scholars, absorbing their wisdom to justify his wars as holy struggles. To his men, he was both a feared commander and a provider of plunder. To his enemies, he was a shadow on the horizon, swift, merciless, unstoppable. By the end of his youth, Timur had set his eyes beyond tribal squabbles. His ambitions burned higher. He would not be just a tribal chief, nor even a regional ruler. He dreamed of building an empire greater than Genghis Khan's, an empire that combined the ferocity of the steppe with the wealth of Persia, the knowledge of Islam, and the majesty of world history. And with that dream, the young Timur, limping but unbroken, began his path to conquer half the known world. Two monsters of mouth. The steppe has always been a place where only the strongest survive, but in Timur's world, strength alone was not enough. After his youth of raiding and survival, he entered the turbulent political arena of Central Asia. The Chagatai Khanate, once united under the heirs of Genghis Khan, had broken into pieces. Rival clans, each claiming legitimacy, fought for control of Transoxiana. And Timur knew he could be that man. In his 20s, Timur allied himself with Amir Hussein, another ambitious warlord. Together they built a coalition, seizing territory in Transoxiana and establishing themselves as rising powers. Their partnership was built on necessity rather than trust. Hussein provided influence, Timur provided cunning and military genius. Side by side, they defeated rivals and carved out dominion in the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate. But in every campaign, Timur's brilliance overshadowed Hussein's authority. Soldiers whispered of Timur's daring strategies, his strict discipline, his uncanny ability to sense the enemy's weaknesses. Hussein commanded respect, Timur commanded fear. One of Timur's greatest strengths was his ability to recruit and unite men of different origins. He was not bound by narrow tribalism. Persians, Turks, Mongols, and Arabs found a place in his growing army. For some, he promised plunder. For others, glory. For many, survival. In a land fractured by rival lords, Timur's camp became a haven for ambitious warriors. Step by step, raid by raid, his following swelled into an army loyal not to a tribe, but to his person. This was new. Timur was not just a chieftain, he was building the foundation of empire. The alliance with Hussein eventually collapsed. As many had expected, Hussein grew wary of Timur's growing influence and tried to tighten control. Timur, who never tolerated a partner in power, turned against him. In 1370, after a series of conflicts, Timur besieged Hussein in bulk. When Hussein finally surrendered, Timur ordered him executed. The act shocked many, but secured his rule. In the aftermath, Timur solidified his authority by marrying Hussein's widow, Sare Mulk Khanum, a woman of direct descent from Genghis Khan. This was not just a marriage, it was a claim to legitimacy. Timur, though not a descendant of Genghis himself, now tied his bloodline to the great Khan. From then on, he styled himself as a restorer of the Mongol Empire. Timur understood the power of symbolism. He placed puppet Khans of Genghis's lineage on the throne of the Chagatai Khanate, while keeping all real power in his own hands. To his followers, it appeared that the ancient order of Genghis was being honored. In truth, Timur ruled supreme as Amir, the commander. This delicate balance between tradition and personal ambition would become a hallmark of his rule. By the 1370s, Timur had established his capital at Samarkand, transforming the city into the beating heart of his realm. From there, he began a campaign of consolidation, crushing rivals, raiding rebellious tribes, and forging alliances through both steel and diplomacy. His cruelty was already becoming legend. Towns that resisted were annihilated, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Those that submitted were spared and rewarded. To friend and foe alike, Timur's message was clear. Obedience meant survival. Defiance meant extinction. Timur's methods were not only violent, but also brilliantly calculated. He spread fear deliberately, ensuring that future enemies would surrender before a battle even began. His soldiers erected towers of skulls from the bodies of the defeated, horrific monuments designed to echo across Central Asia. This psychological warfare saved Timur time, resources, and lives on the battlefield, while cementing his reputation as a man who could not be opposed. By the end of this phase of his life, Timur had risen from a minor noble with a crippled leg to the uncontested master of Transoxiana. His army was hardened, his authority unquestioned, and his ambitions burning. The world beyond the steppe, rich Persia to the west, India to the south, the fractured Golden Horde to the north, lay vulnerable. But Timur was no reckless raider. He planned carefully, striking only when his enemies were weakest, always positioning himself as the instrument of divine will and the heir to Genghis Khan's empire. In 1370, standing in Samarkand, Timur declared his destiny. He was no longer Timur the tribal warlord. He was Timur the great Amir, chosen to restore order to a shattered world. The rise was complete. The conquest of the world was about to begin. With Samarkand as his capital and supreme authority in Transoxiana firmly established, Timur's ambitions turned outward. The 1370s and 1380s became years of relentless expansion as he extended his dominion over the fragmented lands of Central Asia. In this arena, Timur revealed the qualities that would define his empire: military brilliance, ruthless cruelty, and an uncanny ability to turn political chaos to his advantage. Central Asia in the late 4th century was a patchwork of khanates, tribal confederations, and city-states. The once mighty Chagatai Khanate had splintered, leaving a vacuum of power. Persian cities to the west were weakened by dynastic struggles. Nomadic tribes along the steppe sought to raid rather than govern. This instability was Timur's opportunity. He styled himself as a restorer of order, an heir to Genghis Khan, whose mission was to reunite the lands under strong leadership. Yet his methods were anything but merciful. Timur's campaigns across Central Asia were conducted with precision. He combined the light cavalry tactics of the Mongols with his own innovations in siege warfare. His horsemen moved like shadows, striking swiftly at enemy supply lines, outmaneuvering larger forces, and retreating before counterattacks. But when cities resisted, he unleashed his full fury. Samarkand's granaries and markets, filled with the wealth of plundered towns, its streets filled with artisans, scholars, and craftsmen, forcibly relocated from conquered lands. One of his early targets was Khwarezm, the region along the Amudarya River. The Khwarezmian rulers resisted, and Timur responded with devastation. Cities were razed, populations massacred or deported, and the survivors forced to acknowledge his supremacy. This ruthless strategy was deliberate. Timur believed fear was the most efficient weapon. Resistance was punished with extermination, while submission brought relative mercy. The choice was clear to those who faced him: surrender and live under Timur's rule, or defy him and face annihilation. Timur's expansion was not purely military. He proved himself a master of political manipulation. When confronting tribal leaders, he offered them positions in his administration, marriages into his family, or shares of plunder. Many who might have opposed him instead became his allies. Those who hesitated too long were destroyed. Through this mixture of diplomacy and terror, Timur forged a power base that stretched far beyond Samarkand. By the early 3080s, Timur's armies pushed northward against the Mogolistan tribes in the Ili and Chu valleys. These semi-nomadic clans resisted fiercely, but Timur's cavalry excelled in the open steppe. He defeated them in battle after battle, driving them eastward. Though he never fully subdued Mogolistan, he ensured they would remain too weak to threaten his rear during his later campaigns. His strategy was always pragmatic. If complete conquest was impossible, crippling an enemy to remove them as a danger was sufficient. Equally important was Timur's push into Persia. Though this campaign would later become central to his empire, his first moves into Persian territory began during this period. Rival dynasties, the Sarbadars in Khorasan, the Muzaffarids further west, were locked in civil wars. Timur exploited their weakness, presenting himself as a champion of Islam who would bring stability. In reality, he intended to plunder their wealth and absorb their skilled administrators. Persian scribes, architects, and artisans captured during these wars were deported to Samarkand, where they began transforming the city into a cultural and architectural wonder. While Timur conquered with sword and fire, he also cultivated an image of divine legitimacy. He supported Islamic scholars and ordered mosques to be built in conquered lands. Clerics declared his campaigns as jihad against infidels and rebels. This gave Timur a veneer of religious justification, even as he slaughtered Muslim populations with the same brutality as non-Muslims. His ability to manipulate ideology made him not only feared, but also, in some quarters, respected as a man chosen by God to rule. By the end of the 1380s, Timur had transformed himself from a regional warlord into the undisputed master of Central Asia. His empire stretched from the Sur Daria in the north to the borders of Persia in the west. Samarkand glittered with wealth and captives, a city of forced brilliance rising on the bones of the conquered. Towers of skulls stood as grim monuments across Central Asia, silent witnesses to his ruthlessness. The world was beginning to take notice. To the south lay India, rich and unstable. To the west, Persia beckoned with its fractured dynasties. To the north, the Golden Horde posed both threat and opportunity. Timur stood ready. Central Asia was his. The greater world awaited. By the late 1380s, Timur had secured his dominance over Central Asia. Yet he was not content to be a steppe warlord. His ambitions demanded the wealth, culture, and prestige of Persia. For centuries, Persia had been the jewel of Islamic civilization. Its cities, from Herat to Shiraz, were centers of art, science, and trade. But in Timur's time, Persia was politically fractured, torn apart by civil wars among rival dynasties, the Sarbadars in Khorasan, Jaliyarids in Iraq, and the Muzaffarids in Fars. To Timur, this division was an invitation. To his men, it promised riches beyond imagination. Timur's first incursions into Persia began in Khorasan, where the Sarbadars, a militant religious movement, controlled key cities. The Sarbadars had risen as champions of justice against Mongol oppression, but by Timur's day, their zeal had degenerated into infighting. Timur descended upon them with his cavalry, defeating their forces with ease. Herat, the jewel of Khorasan, fell to him in 1381. The city resisted, and Timur made it pay dearly. Thousands were massacred, and the survivors deported to Samarkand. Yet, among the captives, Timur carefully spared artisans, scholars, and architects, transporting them to his capital to glorify his empire. This would become his hallmark: destruction followed by forced enrichment of Samarkand. From Khorasan, Timur marched deeper into Persia. Each campaign followed a grimly familiar pattern. Cities that submitted were spared, at least in part. Those that resisted were annihilated. Towers of skulls rose across Persian soil, terrifying survivors into submission. His campaigns were not mere conquests, they were deliberate acts of psychological warfare. Tales of his cruelty spread faster than his armies, often causing towns to surrender before he even arrived. Timur's wars also had a political dimension. He declared himself a defender of Islam, presenting his conquests as a holy mission to bring unity and justice. In reality, he was as ruthless toward Muslims as he was toward non-Muslims. The muftis and clerics who supported him were well rewarded, while those who opposed were silenced, often permanently. For Timur, religion was a tool, not a guide. By the early 1390s, Timur's campaigns extended into western Persia and Iraq, targeting the Jalayirid dynasty. Baghdad, a shadow of its former Abbasid glory, fell under his control. In Shiraz, heart of the Muzaffarid dynasty, Timur demonstrated both cruelty and cunning. After defeating the Muzaffarid rulers, he spared poets and scholars, including the great Persian writer Hafez, whose verses he admired. Such acts reinforced the image Timur sought to cultivate, a conqueror who destroyed ruthlessly, but also appreciated beauty and intellect, a patron of culture, as well as a lord of war. Persia provided Timur with more than treasure. It gave him administrators, engineers, and architects who elevated Samarkand into a city that astonished all who saw it. Domes of turquoise tile, vast mosques, and caravanserais rose under their forced labor. Captive artisans from Shiraz decorated palaces. Engineers from Isfahan designed aqueducts. Scribes from Herat filled libraries with manuscripts. Samarkand became a crossroads of Persian sophistication and Mongol ferocity, a monument to Timur's vision of empire. But Persia also revealed Timur's darker obsession with terror as a weapon. The massacre at Isfahan in 1387 remains one of the bloodiest episodes of his career. After a rebellion erupted in the city, Timur ordered the execution of tens of thousands. Chroniclers claimed that 70,000 skulls were stacked into pyramids outside the walls. Whether the number was exaggerated or not, the psychological impact was immense. From that point onward, few Persian cities dared to resist him openly. By the end of the 1390s, Timur had subdued nearly all of Persia, stretching his dominion to the Persian Gulf. His empire now encompassed the richest cities of the Islamic world, their wealth and knowledge flowing into Samarkand. But Timur was not finished. Persia was only one jewel in his crown. To the north, the Golden Horde loomed as both a rival and an opportunity. To the south, the wealth of India beckoned. To the west, the Ottoman Turks were rising as a new imperial power. For Timur, Persia was not an end, but a stepping stone. He had conquered one of the most sophisticated civilizations on earth and bent it to his will. Now, with Samarkand glittering like a captured star, he prepared to unleash his armies further than ever before. By the closing years of the 14th century, Timur's empire stretched across Central Asia and Persia. Yet his ambition was never satisfied. To the south lay the riches of India, a land whose wealth had dazzled conquerors since antiquity. The Delhi Sultanate controlled vast territories, but its throne was unstable, plagued by rebellions and weak leadership. To Timur, India was both an irresistible prize and an opportunity to display his genius for terror and strategy. In 1398, Timur began his march into India. Crossing the Indus River with an army hardened by decades of conquest, he entered the Punjab. Resistance was fierce at first. Local warlords and Indian princes raised armies, but Timur's cavalry crushed them with brutal efficiency. His progress was marked by plunder and massacre. Entire towns were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The march itself became a tide of destruction, designed to spread fear before he ever reached Delhi. End of chapter 4. The climax of the campaign came near the capital. when Timur faced the forces of the Delhi Sultan Masih Dashud-Din Mahmud Tughlaq. The Sultan's army was vast, bolstered by tens of thousands of soldiers and, most notoriously, a terrifying corps of war elephants. Armored, adorned with steel plates and spiked tusks, the elephants were living fortresses, capable of crushing cavalry charges and scattering infantry. For centuries, Indian rulers had used them as the ultimate battlefield weapon. Timur's men, though hardened, were unsettled by the sight of these colossal beasts. But Timur was never a man to be intimidated. Where others saw indestructible monsters, he saw weaknesses to be exploited. Before the battle, he devised one of the most cunning tactics of his career. His soldiers rounded up camels from the baggage train, piling their backs with dry grass, brushwood, and hay. At the moment of confrontation, Timur gave a shocking order. The camels were set on fire and driven straight toward the enemy elephants. The effect was devastating. The flaming, screaming camels bolted in terror, charging into the ranks of the elephants. Overcome by the sight and smell of fire, the elephants panicked. They turned not on Timur's men, but on their own masters, trampling soldiers, breaking lines, and spreading chaos throughout the Sultan's army. What had been Delhi's greatest weapon became its downfall. Timur's cavalry seized the moment, charging into the disordered enemy ranks. The battle turned into a slaughter. The mighty host of the Sultan collapsed under Timur's relentless assault. Delhi itself lay defenseless. When Timur entered the city, he unleashed horror on an unimaginable scale. Though the Sultan submitted, Timur gave his soldiers 3 days to plunder at will. The result was a massacre, remembered as one of the darkest episodes in the city's history. Tens of thousands were killed. Entire districts were burned. Chroniclers described the streets littered with corpses, the air thick with smoke, and the survivors enslaved or deported. Wealth flowed northward to Samarkand, carried by caravans of treasure, artisans, and captives. Yet Timur was careful to present his invasion not as mere greed, but as holy war. He declared that the Delhi Sultanate had grown corrupt and unworthy of ruling Muslims, and that his campaign was sanctioned by God. To his followers, the bloodshed was divine justice. To his victims, it was apocalyptic destruction. After only a few months, Timur withdrew from India. He had no desire to govern such a distant and turbulent land. His purpose had been plunder, intimidation, and glory, and he achieved all three. The wealth of Delhi enriched Samarkand, financing grand mosques, gardens, and palaces. The artisans and scholars deported from India joined the growing cultural mosaic of Timur's capital. For India, however, his invasion left scars that endured for generations. The campaign against India displayed Timur's unique combination of brutality and brilliance. He had taken one of the strongest armies in the region, shattered it through cunning strategy, and reduced one of the richest cities of the medieval world to ash. For Timur, it was proof that no enemy, no matter how powerful, was beyond his reach. As he returned to Samarkand laden with treasure, his days turned westward once again. Beyond Persia and the mountains lay the rising power of the Ottoman Turks, and Timur was already plotting their downfall. After his devastating victory in India, Timur returned to Samarkand in triumph. His capital was now overflowing with treasure, artisans, and scholars captured from across Asia. But Timur was not a man to rest on his laurels. His gaze turned westward, toward the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East, lands rich in history, faith, and political opportunity. There he would face not only weakened dynasties, but also the rising force of the Ottoman Empire. His clash with the Ottomans would become one of the defining moments of his career. Timur's first targets were the fractured kingdoms of Persia's western neighbors. In Iraq and Syria, rival dynasties like the Jalayirids and the Mamluks vied for supremacy. Timur's armies descended on them with familiar brutality. Baghdad, though a shadow of its Abbasid glory, still held symbolic importance. When it resisted him in 1401, Timur ordered one of his most infamous massacres. Chroniclers record that 90,000 inhabitants were slaughtered, and pyramids of skulls were erected at the city gates. The message was unmistakable. Timur was now the master of the Islamic world's former capital. From Iraq, he pushed into Syria, clashing with the Mamluks. Damascus, one of the great cities of the Muslim world, fell after a brief siege. As in Delhi, Timur allowed his troops to plunder the city, carrying away craftsmen and treasures to Samarkand. The conquest of Damascus sent shockwaves through the Middle East. Timur was no longer just a Central Asian conqueror. He had become a figure who reshaped the destiny of the Islamic world. Yet, the greatest confrontation lay ahead. To the northwest, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt, was forging a powerful empire. Bayezid had expanded Ottoman lands deep into the Balkans and Anatolia, threatening both Christian kingdoms in Europe and Muslim powers in the East. Ambitious, proud, and unyielding, Bayezid was as fiery as Timur was calculating. Inevitably, their paths collided. The conflict began with rivalry over Anatolia, where many small Turkish emirates sought protection from either Timur or Bayezid. When Bayezid annexed several of these beyliks, their rulers appealed to Timur for aid. Timur, always eager to exploit division, declared himself the protector of Anatolia's rightful lords. Bayezid responded with defiance. The two greatest Muslim rulers of their age exchanged insults and letters, each accusing the other of arrogance and tyranny. War became inevitable. In the summer of 1402, the two armies met on the plains near Ankara. Bayezid's force was formidable, perhaps 70,000 men, including his elite janissaries and his own corps of war elephants. Timur's host was larger, with contingents drawn from across his vast empire, numbering perhaps 100,000. The battle will decide not only Anatolia's fate, but also which man would dominate the Islamic world. Timur prepared with his usual cunning. He secured the water sources around the battlefield, depriving Bayezid's men of vital supplies during the scorching Anatolian summer. He also enticed many of Bayezid's Turkic vassals to defect during the fighting, promising them lands and rewards. When the battle began, Bayezid's army fought fiercely, but Timur's maneuvering proved decisive. His cavalry encircled the Ottomans, his archers rained arrows, and his elephants, captured in India and now turned against a new foe, added to the chaos. After a brutal day of combat, Bayezid's army collapsed. The unthinkable happened. Sultan Bayezid himself was captured alive. Chroniclers tell many tales of his fate. Some claim Timur mocked him, keeping him in an iron cage, forcing him to watch his empire unravel. Others suggest Timur treated him with a measure of respect, as befitted a fellow monarch. Whatever the truth, Bayezid died in captivity less than a year later, broken by defeat. The Battle of Ankara was one of Timur's greatest triumphs. The Ottoman Empire, on the brink of conquering Constantinople and Europe, was thrown into chaos. Bayezid's sons fell into civil war, a period known as the Ottoman Interregnum, which delayed Ottoman expansion for decades. Timur had humbled one of the most powerful rulers of the age and proven once again that no kingdom was beyond his reach. Yet Timur had no intention of permanently ruling Anatolia or the Balkans. As in India, he plundered, redistributed power among local rulers, and withdrew. His aim was not to build a centralized empire like the Ottomans, but to demonstrate his supremacy, enrich Samarkand, and secure his legacy as the greatest conqueror since Genghis Khan. From Ankara, Timur returned eastward. His empire now stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of China. But even in his 70s, he was not finished. His eyes turned east once more, to the fabled lands of Cathay, where he dreamed of a final campaign that would outshine all others. The victory at Ankara in 1402 marked the height of Timur's power. Few rulers in history had ever commanded such vast dominion. From the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, from the Caucasus to the edges of India, his influence stretched over a world fractured by smaller kings and rival dynasties. He was already in his late 60s, yet his ambition burned with the same ferocity as in youth. For Timur, conquest was not merely a means to power, it was his destiny, the very purpose of his existence. After his triumph over Bayezid, Timur returned to Samarkand, which he had steadily transformed into one of the greatest capitals of the medieval world. The city dazzled travelers with its turquoise domes, monumental mosques, and bustling markets filled with treasures from every corner of his empire. Artisans and architects from Persia, India, and Syria labored side by side, creating wonders that would endure long after Timur's death. To his admirers, Samarkand shone like a jewel. To his victims, it was built on blood. But Timur did not linger long. In 1403 and 1404, he turned his attention to the Caucasus. He campaigned against Georgia, Armenia, and other Christian kingdoms of the region, devastating cities, enslaving populations, and cementing his reputation as a scourge of both Muslim and non-Muslim lands alike. Chroniclers record with horror the burning of Tbilisi and the enslavement of thousands. Timur justified these actions as punishment for resistance, but in reality, they were part of his larger strategy to ensure that no rival power could ever threaten his empire's western frontier. Even as he approached his 70s, Timur remained restless. His ultimate dream had always been to rival and surpass Genghis Khan. He had defeated Persia, humbled India, and crushed the Ottomans. Yet one great prize remained unconquered: China, the ancient empire of Cathay. The Yuan dynasty, heirs of Genghis Khan, had been overthrown by the native Ming dynasty in 1368. To Timur, the Ming rulers were usurpers, illegitimate occupants of the throne that should have belonged to Mongol descendants. Conquering China would not only avenge the legacy of the great Khan, but also crown Timur as the supreme world conqueror. In 1404, despite his advanced age and failing health, Timur began preparations for his grandest campaign. Chroniclers describe an enormous host assembling near Samarkand, perhaps 200,000 strong, including contingents from every corner of his dominion. Supplies were stockpiled, bridges constructed, and routes mapped across the steppes toward the Great Wall. For Timur, it was to be his final and greatest triumph. But fate intervened. As the campaign advanced eastward, Timur fell gravely ill during the harsh winter of 1404 to 1405. The march slowed as his health deteriorated. Near the city of Otrar, on the Syr Darya, he collapsed. Despite the efforts of his physicians, the conqueror who had terrorized half the known world breathed his last on February 17, 1405, at the age of 68 or 69. His army, stunned, halted its advance. The dream of conquering China died with him. Timur's death left his vast empire without a single undisputed heir. Though he had many sons and grandsons, none possessed his combination of ruthlessness, genius, and charisma. Succession struggles soon followed, fragmenting the empire he had built. Yet Timur had prepared carefully for his own memory. He had ordered a grand mausoleum built in Samarkand, the Gur-e-Amir, where his body was laid to rest beneath a slab of dark jade. The epitaph, engraved upon his tomb, warned that whoever opens this will unleash an invader more terrible than I. Centuries later, when Soviet archaeologists violated the tomb in 1941, legend claimed that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union the very next day. Timur departed this world as he had lived in it, shrouded in fear, legend, and mystery. His dream of universal conquest was left unfinished, but his mark upon history was indelible. Even in death, the shadow of Timur loomed large, a reminder of the conqueror who limped across continents and bent nations to his will. Timur died in 1405, leaving behind an empire that was vast, fearsome, and fragile. His successors would struggle to preserve what he had built, but while the empire itself fragmented within decades, his legacy endured for centuries. Few figures in medieval history left such a paradoxical imprint, remembered as both a ruthless destroyer and a brilliant patron of culture. In the immediate Atad-say, Jepharos was taken to the court. His empire, held together by the sheer force of his will, could not long survive without his iron grip. Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus soon slipped away, while rival powers regained their strength. Yet in Central Asia, particularly in Samarkand and Herat, the dynasty he founded, the Timurids, continued to rule for nearly a century. Sandet del Oba, wild.
And though they lacked his military genius, the Timurids became patrons of the arts, turning their courts into some of the most brilliant cultural centers of the Islamic world.
Perhaps Timur's greatest lasting gift was his transformation of Samarkand. He had summoned architects, scholars, and artisans from every conquered land to beautify his capital. The Registan, with its vast madrasas and shimmering blue tiles, and the Gur Amir, his own mausoleum, remain among the finest masterpieces of Islamic architecture. These monuments proclaimed not only his power, but also his vision of Samarkand as a universal capital, a crossroads where Persian, Turkic, and Mongol traditions fused. Even today, visitors see in Samarkand the imprint of Timur's ambition. Culturally, the Timurid Renaissance was profound. His descendants, especially Shah Rukh and the famous Prince Ulu Beg, nurtured advances in science, literature, and the arts. Ulu Beg, a grandson of Timur, built a great observatory in Samarkand, where astronomers charted the heavens with remarkable precision. Persian poetry flourished, miniature painting reached new heights, and scholars recorded the histories of empires. In this sense, Timur's bloody conquests inadvertently paved the way for a flowering of creativity. Timur's legacy also extended beyond Central Asia. His descendants in India would establish the Mughal dynasty, one of the most powerful and sophisticated empires in early modern history. Babur, a direct descendant of Timur through his father, and of Genghis Khan through his mother, carried the Timurid line into the subcontinent in the 16th century. The Mughals built upon the cultural and architectural traditions of Timur's court, blending Persian, Indian, and Central Asian elements into a dazzling new synthesis. The Taj Mahal, centuries later, could be seen as a distant echo of Timur's dream of monumental architecture. Yet Timur's memory remained deeply controversial. In the lands he conquered, he was often cursed as a tyrant, a butcher whose campaigns left mountains of skulls and cities in ruins. In Christian Europe, he was both feared and admired. Feared for his cruelty, admired for his victories over common enemies, such as the Ottoman Turks. Renaissance chroniclers portrayed him as a new Attila or Alexander, a man whose deeds defied ordinary description. In the Islamic world, some regarded him as a defender of faith against rivals, while others condemned his merciless treatment of fellow Muslims. Over time, his image shifted depending on who told his story. In Central Asia, especially in modern Uzbekistan, he is celebrated as a national hero, the father of statehood, and a unifying figure. His statues adorn city squares, and his name inspires pride. In contrast, in Persia, Iraq, and India, his memory often carries a darker weight, recalling the devastation his armies wrought. The duality of Timur's legacy, creator and destroyer, patron and butcher, remains unresolved. Ultimately, the legacy of Tamerlane is the story of ambition carried to its absolute extreme. He reshaped the map of Asia, crushed empires, and left behind cities both ruined and reborn. He saw himself as the heir of Genghis Khan, yet in some ways he surpassed even that model, blending nomadic ferocity with urban grandeur. While his empire did not last, the monuments of Samarkand, the brilliance of Timurid art, and the dynasties that sprang from his bloodline ensured that his name would echo through the centuries. Timur's life embodied the contradictions of empire. He was at once the destroyer of worlds and the builder of civilizations. His shadow stretched across continents, and his memory continues to provoke awe, fear, and fascination. More than 6 centuries after his death, the conqueror who limped into legend still commands our imagination.